So today we have another of those going to be a short episodes. Here, I'll just summarize. I know some of you like the TLDR version, so here it is. It's a good episode, go watch it. Now that we've got that out of the way, I just have to comment on the joke at the beginning. Deliberate joke, which was the John Carter thing. You know, Miss Carter, whose grandfather was one of the people who helped settle Mars. John Carter. If you don't get it, don't worry about it, but lol. I also, however, found something else interesting. So, this is kind of super spoiling, leaping ahead, but one of the things mentioned, this isn't a super spoiler, it's a spoiler for this episode, and if you're worried about that, then you're in the wrong place. Later on, they mentioned that all of this is being run by a Bureau 13. In fact, the writers of Babylon 5 have flat out said that they believe that several of the clandestine operations that have already happened on the station have happened as a result of Bureau 13. Most notably, the incident with Night 1 and Night 2, which happened back in Season 1. Now, what I find funny about this is the writers were completely unaware of the fact that there was a they claimed they were unaware, but I believe them. I see no reason to lie about this. That there was a tabletop P&P game called Bureau 13, which was about clandestine spy stuff, which is kind of why I raised my eyebrow at the disbelief thing. But nevertheless, they pretty much immediately erased all mention of Bureau 13 from the show after this point. We will never hear from them again. When asked about it, the intimation in-universe in stories that Bureau 13 was absorbed by one of the greater organizations of the various clandestine groups that exist back on Earth. I just thought that was a nice little touch. I also liked the touch of the San Diego wastelands. I've said it before a lot in Season 1. We get impressions of how things back on Earth are not exactly paradise. This is not Star Trek, where Earth is this beacon of hope and joy that's the one safe port in the galaxy. The San Diego wastelands are a great way to shine a light on that, first of all. I do find myself wondering how much of that was devastation because of the problems Earth has been having in general. Remember, Earth is not truly united. Or maybe it's something that the Minbari did. I mean, you know, they were right there after all. Who knows? It's more likely that it was Earth internecine problems, though. The other reason I find that funny is I used to live in San Diego when I was much, much younger. And it was rather satisfying seeing it like that. I don't have good memories of that place. I'm kidding. I wouldn't want to see San Diego nuked. That's terrible. There's a great line here about all species can trade neutrally on Babylon 5, even our own. I like that line because it establishes several things, even if we didn't already know those. First of all, it pretty much helps reinforce the fact that Sheridan does not like politicians, as a senator calls him up and orders him, in all but literal form, to spy on a civilian transaction. That does a lot of work. So first of all, it establishes the way the Senate views Babylon 5 as an arm of the Senate, as an arm of EarthGov. Not of the Alliance, not of the military, but of EarthGov. Second of all, it shines a light on how the Senate views the entire Mars situation as incredibly volatile, and basically they view Mars as an enemy rather than an organization that needs to be dealt with. And I make that distinction. I'm not saying I blame them for that, by the way, but I make that distinction because your attitude towards someone who you automatically view as an enemy is going to be different than someone you view as someone you need to deal with. You're more likely, for example, to deal more peaceably, to be more diplomatic, to trade with someone you are dealing with, rather than someone who you are already their enemy, or you already view them as your enemy, more accurately. Now, again, I don't necessarily blame them for that. And remember that as recently as Season 1, there was another incident on Mars with the infighting and whatnot. And poor Garibaldi had some heartbreaking situations regarding that. But nevertheless, it is an interesting attitude. I'm reminded of something that I've talked about many, many, many times. The Horde and the Alliance over on Warcraft. And the fact that it's so difficult for peace to happen because you need both sides to agree to peace, and then you need no one to screw it up. And both sides and neutral parties. So you've got three separate categories of people and organizations who are actively interested in getting in the way of peace. kind of hard for that to happen under those circumstances, and we see that in this episode. I I do find it absolutely fascinating, the plan for Mars's independence through economic independence, through trade. Maybe that's just the economist in me. Long-term viewers know that I am a bit of an economy geek, and of course I am a political geek and a history geek and a strategy geek. So this just kind of hits all my buttons. The idea that an entire planetary government can establish independence without military opposition through economic superiority, thanks to long-term beneficial connections with alien races. The idea here, and they don't say it outright, but I could outline almost the whole idea for you. I could just extrapolate on what little we know. I'm not going to. That would be stupid and boring for most of you, I'm sure. I know not everyone else out there is an economist geek like I am. But I love the idea that make Mars so valuable in terms of resources, in terms of connections, and in terms of conduit for so many alien races, the non-aligned worlds, the Centauri, the Minbara, it doesn't matter, just connect with them, so that any military action other groups take, like EarthGov, against Mars will automatically be met with resistance, not by Mars, but by the people working with Mars. Now, that's not universal, of course, and there's some gray on that, but it's a great way to establish a defensive network without dumping tons of money on troops and ships. It is a long-term plan, and as Talia Winters herself points out, it is at short-term deficit. But if it worked, it would work brilliantly. It's a great plan. I love the idea. And I like the idea that they'll continue going forward in the future. As a result of Sheridan's deal with Miss Carter at the end of the episode. I also wanted to talk... Where's my notes? Hang on. I lost my track. Where am I? I guess we'll move on. I like there's a scene here. I've talked about this many times on Babylon 5 and on Voyager. And I'll probably talk about it in the future when we get to TNG, Deep Space Nine, Farscape, Clone Wars, Firefly. No, I'm kidding. I'm not doing Firefly. Sorry to tease you. But there's a scene where it's just a scene between Ivanova and Sheridan, and they're just enjoying a meal. And once again, the question of padding comes up. In this case, it's a little debatable if it was padding, because it doesn't add anything to the plot, and it only adds a little bit to the setting, but I think it is not padding because it adds a lot to the character. It actually shines a light on Sheridan's personality. We've seen basically three aspects of his personality throughout the 6, 7? What are we up to right now? Hang on. 6 episodes now that we've seen him. First of all, of course, we've seen the military man, the commander. We've seen the man who cares, for lack of a better way to put that. And this is an aspect we've only seen once before, and we'll be seeing more in the future. The explorer, the man who really enjoys, for lack of a better way to put this, the wonders of the universe. Someone who, to quote Carrie over in Voyager in the episode One Small Step, we were right to come out here. He's one of those people who would firmly believe, it was right for humanity to go out into the stars and discover just how amazing the galaxy can be. And the simple wonder with which Bruce Boxleitner, I really hope I'm pronouncing his name right, says the lines about how, it was amazing being on this alien ship, trying to contact with them, trying to coordinate with them, seeing how they work together, and how amazing and wonderful and incredible it was. The way he presents his lines gets across the wonder and enthusiasm better than the lines themselves does. It's a great performance. So I would argue, once again, this is not padding. Something Babylon 5 is very good at. Having no padding, in other words. It has what my friend, I shouldn't say my friend, my viewer, Zawan Joker would call flavoring fat, rather than marbled, watery fat. I wonder if he watches these. So, really good presentation from, oh god, I can't think of her name, the actress who plays Talia in this episode. She does a lot of things very nice in this episode. I'll be talking about some of those later. But the one thing I like is how she's talking about the gentleman who died, and she starts off angry, and she just sort of dissolves slowly during the dialogue into grief. It's a nice presentation, and the way she acts towards Garibaldi later is perfect. In both the scenes with her and Garibaldi, it was really good to see an actual friendship grow there, rather than him just hitting on her, which is basically what it's been up until now. And it does show that he is actually trying to cheer her up, because he actually gives a damn, rather than just, you're attractive and I want to be with you. And her nervous laugh after he gets a joke out of her, and them discussing their upbringing. It was a nice touch, very human, ironically, very well done. I find it very interesting. I don't think this really qualifies as a spoiler, but I do find it very, very interesting how Ivanova has, as of this episode, season 2, episode 6, clearly demonstrates a degree of trust and value in Talia Winters. Given her extremely anti telepath and very anti Psychor mentality, that's interesting, as she herself says. Sheridan has an absolutely amazing quote. This whole series has a lot of great speeches. Forgive me for paraphrasing this, but he says, telepaths are blessed and cursed in ways I can't even begin to understand. But they're still people with agendas, people who can be good, bad, or indifferent. I trust individuals, not organizations. I like that quote a lot. It's actually kind of similar to something I tend to feel in my real life perspective. And then Ivanova pretty much hits him with, trust Talia, don't trust Psychor. And he just kind of nods at that and decides to take her at his word. After all, he has a lot of trust in Ivanova. This is a small topic, which I feel like discussing in brief. I hope you don't mind, because that's kind of how trust works. Most of the times, we don't actually know the people we're trusting that well. You ever notice that? Like, like, for example, my sister. I know my sister extremely well. And I trust her as much as I trust people. Anyway, obviously I don't trust anyone. But, I trust her. And she will vouch for someone else. I'm not going to give names. It doesn't matter. Bob. So she'll vouch for Bob. Now, I will now trust Bob because I trust her. But I don't actually know Bob, do I? It's interesting how that works, because that's how human society works in general, isn't it? And it branches out, and it gets funny the more you analyze it, and the more you see how far those chains can get. Because what if Bob trusts, Jill? Do I then trust Jill because Bob trusts Jill? What if Jill trusts Jane? And what if Jane trusts Ted? And what if Ted trusts Great Value Forks? Because I've got some... Right, I'm running out of names. Trusts Thrall. I don't know. But we're like 7 people down the line here. You ever play the telephone game? I've talked about this before. The telephone game, it's called something else in Europe. I've been informed of this, but I can't remember right now. Forgive me. Is when you are told something, you're given a story with details. That's the important part. And then in secret, you tell it to someone. And then in secret, they tell it to someone. And you go down the line. And you're supposed to be like 20 people. And then the very first, once they get through it, the very last person tells the story out loud. And the very first person tells the story out loud. And I have personally never had an instance where it is the same story from the first person to the last person, because that's human nature. What we take in and what we put out is different based on our individual perspectives. It's the same thing with trust. I trust my sister, Zanastma, because ... Here's my criteria for trust. She meets them. I trust her. Her criteria for trust is different than mine. But this other gentleman, Bob, I think was the first step. Person 1, we're just going to start numbering them. 1 is someone she trusts because they meet her requirements. 2 is someone 1 trusts because they meet his requirements, and so forth and so on. It's funny because this is actually how an organization exists. The very concept of an organization is exactly this. A person who trusts a person, who trusts a person, who trusts a person, who trusts a person, however many times, 100, 1,000, million, doesn't matter. And then all of them are expected to then, by social requirement and by the way our brains work, trust each other, Even though it is entirely feasible, and indeed I would say extremely likely, that if I was specifically asked to trust person 37 down the line, person 37 would not meet my requirements for trust. And yet person 37 meets person 36's requirements for trust. And you see how this works. I don't think that was deliberately done in this episode, but it is very interesting to think about to me nonetheless. Because the very concept of trusting an individual or of an organization is by itself a flawed perspective, and I admit that myself, even though I espouse the same philosophy. More info on Garibaldi's father, just some great human interactions between him and Talia. Really, really good character stuff there. I just want to say one thing. We owe a lot to Garibaldi's father, because he gave us Garibaldi. I think several of us would agree on that. Yeah? Okay. So, the Lazarus Project. First of all, I imagine a lot of my viewers have played Mass Effect 2. If you ever wondered where they got that from, here you go. The Lazarus Project, though, is absolutely horrifying. Ignoring the fact that it's basically trying to make what Garibaldi so accurately termed cyborg zombies, mind-controlled people who are very, very good infiltrators. Ignoring the horror of that, the way which the computer slaves the mind is absolutely terrifying. I want you to imagine for a moment that you died. We'll pick a horrible death. You burned. No, let's not go with that. Let's say you drowned. That's pretty horrible too, right? Now, I understand if you don't want to picture this with me, but picture drowning to death, just really quick. Picture being under the water, something's wrapped around your legs or something. You cannot get to the surface. Surface is like 2 inches from your face. It's right here. You can't reach it. And I'm making this more horrible, aren't I? And it gets to the point where your muscle and your body and your lungs start to rebel against what your mind is telling them, and you cannot fight it anymore, and literal reflexive survival programming, for lack of a better term, in the body takes over, and you inhale, and all that water goes into your lungs and floods your lungs, and there's this horrible, terrible experience, and it's pretty horrible death, okay? We'll cut it off there. It's a pretty horrible death. Now I want you to imagine that that's... You picture that, and then it finally blessedly ends, and then it starts over again. And you feel the whole thing all over again. Water's right there, trying to hold your breath, struggling to get to the surface, and then the water comes in, and the horrible clenching terror and pain everywhere and death, and then it starts over again, and over again, and over again, and over again. Think about that for a moment. From a purely from a purely amoral perspective, it makes sense that you would try to force the brain to focus on one pattern of thoughts so you could control it better. That does make sense. From a moral perspective, that's absolutely horrifyingly disgusting. Let me use another death as an example. I'm sure some of my viewers will understand this one better. I want you to picture that you're in a spacesuit and you've just been ejected from your ship, the Normandy. And you got a leak in your suit. And you start scrabbling and struggling. You start suffocating. You start having all the effects of space exposure as your body plummets towards the planet. And then if you experience that over and over and over again. Psychor, ladies and gentlemen. What is Psychor's endgame in this? I ask this question with no intention to answer. Their short-term gain is obvious. What they want is for Mars to not actually gain stability, because Mars has no stability right now. And this whole economic plan I just mentioned has a very good chance of working, in my professional opinion, as someone who has studied both economics, history, and politics for most of my life, and strategy for that matter. It's a good plan. It's a plan that has a very strong possibility of making Mars independent in a way that Earth cannot influence them. So it makes perfect sense that Psychor, a Earth-bound organization, would want to try and influence that, especially since Psychor, as we've already established previously in this show, I don't feel this is anything because we've already talked about this, already has its fingers in way too many pots in the government of EarthGov, and they are already pretty much in every way an independent organization with their own hidden agendas. So them wanting to make sure that Mars doesn't stabilize, that makes perfect sense. And yet, there's a few things they do which makes me kind of curious, and I'm just going to leave that there. Now, of course, anybody who's seen the show long-term can answer me, and I ask you not to, because as usual, we're avoiding spoilers. Speaking of which, it's time to bring down the spoiler warning for the first time in a while. So I'm going to try to do the sound effect thing again this time. We'll see if this works a little bit better. Did that work for you? Did that? Spoilers. So those of you who have seen this whole series know this is your last chance. Okay, just making sure. I mean, some of you might have been like, "Oh God, I forgot to pause the video because I was in the earlier room." Okay, this is it. So we are introduced to the concept of control in this episode as an individual. Those of you who've watched this whole series know that Talia Winters is control, sort of. It's more accurate to say that control is a sub-personality programmed into Talia Winters that, in every way, in my opinion, should be considered a separate person from Talia Winters. I mentioned a while ago that there was actually a subplot that they were, because they always planned all the way back in season 1, I forget the name of the episode, to have a back door to bring Talia Winters back. The Vorlons did, you remember that? But that for in-universe and out-of-universe reasons, that actually ended up not happening, and instead Talia Winters was, in every way that matters, destroyed, and her personality was completely erased, and control was the one that took its place. And that's kind of horrifying. But for those of you who knew that, and of thus watching this, wasn't rewatching this episode kind of horrifying, knowing who control is? Look at how Talia interacts in almost every scene she's in. One of the ones that really makes me interested. I mean, it's a quiet horror thing, especially when she orders her own assassination. That was a nice touch, especially considering the fact that he at no point tried to actually kill her when he took her orders to kill her. Not that he knew it was her giving the orders, of course. Nobody did. But the reason I bring this up mostly is towards the end, she lies about Psychor being involved in the Lazarus Project. Now, on first viewing, that makes sense, because Talia Winters is very loyal to Psychor. Ivanova says as much earlier, and we knew this anyway. She's extremely loyal to the core. On repeat viewings, this gets a lot more sinister, because we know Talia is control, or you know what I mean. That control is in Talia would probably be the best way to actually put that. And so it is far more likely that it is control that made the decision to not reveal Psychor's nature to Sheridan. Especially since Psychor is probably aware to some extent or another how much Sheridan has his own fingers in the pot, since, as we'll learn later, this whole hobby of his, of going after clandestine organizations, is not exactly new, and something they would probably be fully aware of. Anyways, hope you've enjoyed the episode, and I will hopefully see you guys next time.